want to welcome you all to our web conference today, Walking in Balance with All Our Relations, Leadership from and Partnerships with Indigenous Communities to End Gender-Based Violence and Restore Wellbeing. My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez. I am with Valor US and Prevent Connect. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor US. And with that, I want to, Will, I'm going to turn it over to you so we can hear from you and introduce us to your team, Lisa and Zach. And Will, it is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Ashley, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Will Crary. I'm with Prevention Institute. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm on Ohlone territory, and I'll share a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. And I'm an associate program manager with Prevention Institute. We are a national public health nonprofit that focuses all on primary prevention and advocating for the community conditions that create thriving neighborhoods, populations, all through the lens of health equity and racial justice. And I'm joined by my lovely colleagues, Lisa Fujie-Parks and Zach Taro, who will both get to share a little bit more on this conference as well. So really grateful that you all are joining. On the next slide, I just wanted to take a second to ground us in what we're doing here today, what we want to achieve together. And so I'm just going to read these objectives. We chose these words for their deep significance that really can bring us together to understand why it is that this is such an important topic. And so briefly, I'll just share that we want to spend this time learning about an approach to sexual and domestic violence prevention that is rooted in Indigenous values and practices. And so we'll get to hear a little bit more about what it means to walk in balance with all of our relations and how that can be in connection to protecting Mother Earth, as well as all of our relationships and what our institutions can do to support that effort. We want to make connections between Indigenous-led transformative movements and public health. So the strategies that we all put forth to create safety and well-being, and how those can be informed by Indigenous practices and really are rooted in Indigenous practices, sometimes without acknowledging them. And then lastly, we want to identify opportunities for non-Indigenous people, organizations, and efforts to honor Indigenous leadership and show up in solidarity and right relationship, being very cautious and conscious of how doing that can often create harm in the form of appropriation, co-optation. And so wanting to know that we're moving into this space in an imperfect way, and that we want to learn by doing, and we want to support one another in moving in the right direction with this work. So that's enough from me about that. This next slide is really important to us, not just on this web conference, but hopefully in all web conferences moving forward. This is a land and people acknowledgement. And so I invite you to go to the link that is being shared in the chat. If you're not familiar with this, this is an opportunity for you to see what Indigenous communities were the original stewards of the land that you are currently on. And taking this opportunity to learn a little bit more, at the very least, about the names of these Indigenous tribes, communities, and peoples, and then changing your name on Zoom right now, just as a small act of solidarity and visibility. And so you can see an example here on the screen of my colleague, Zach, and we see that Zach has Zach Taro, he, him, his, Ohlone territory. And so while you're doing that, take a minute, open up a new window, click on that link, or and change your name with the instructions there on the screen. And while you do that, my colleague Zach is actually going to play a song for us, just to give us a moment to do that and reflect on this practice as well. Right. Well, thank you for sharing that song, Zach, by Joy Harjo, who is a poet laureate. So beyond poetry, it's really wonderful to hear the music of that incredible artist as well. Just to sort of situate us and to take it to the next step, I'm actually going to pass it to my colleague, Lisa, who can lead us in a short land acknowledgement as well.
Thanks, Will, and hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? You cannot hear me. Oh, hang on.
It's a little bit quiet, Lisa.
Okay. Is that better? That's so quiet. Okay, phew. Okay. Thank you, Will. Thank you, community. Lovely to be with you here today, and lovely. I'm having a really powerful reaction to see the acknowledgements coming in, people renaming themselves. And I was starting to try to type in the instructions of how to do that, but it appears that most people know how to do that. And so thank you all for taking the time to do that. It's really lovely to see. And I want to offer a land acknowledgement practice, and I want to express my gratitude to Segorte Land Trust here in the Ohlone here in Oakland, California, and also Dr. Butcher Rislin Bowley for guidance on the practice of land acknowledgement. And we're going to paste in the chat the resources that I consulted in development of this land acknowledgement. So as we gather today online, we take a moment to consider the land that is perhaps just beyond our windows and firmly beneath us, beneath our seats, beneath our feet. This soil, rock, earth, flowing water, and many forms of life. The earth, water, air, and sun support human life, all of our lives, provide all that we need, and support the lives of countless beings and for generations. We take this moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and nations across the United States and across the world. We offer deep respect and gratitude to Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, who have and continue to and will continue to sustain their varied cultures and steward land across this country and across the world in the face of ongoing colonization, genocide, and oppression. We acknowledge their current struggles and the struggles of all people who are working together to bring all of us who live on these lands into right relationship with each other and the land. The intention for these words are acknowledgement, an expression of respect and gratitude, and a commitment to authentic and courageous dialogue, learning, and action, so that intertribal Indigenous communities, lands, languages, ceremonies, names, and stories original to these lands may thrive and sustain for generations to come, and to spur us into action.
Right. Thank you for that, Lisa. I see in the chat someone's requesting a copy of that that intention and land acknowledgement, so we can definitely share that out. Such a powerful resource. And we're gonna actually continue that same intention here. Lisa mentioned this word authentic, and I think it's really important to show up as our whole selves to these often cold spaces, these virtual worlds where it's maybe a little harder to connect. And one way we want to do that today is just dedicating a bit more time to the introductions with the intentions to live into the value of our web conference and this title of Walking in Balance with All Our Relations, which in practice can mean honoring ourselves, our lineage, and the context of our experiences. So like Lisa, I requested permission from a Prevention Institute community partner to use this model, this practice for introducing ourselves. This comes from the Kokua Kalihi Valley Comprehensive Family Services Center, where young men of Micronesian and Pacific Island descent lead culture circles with community members, with staff at the health clinic, with young people in a bike shop to uplift solidarity, sovereignty, and self by beginning the activities with sharing their name, their home, and their ancestor that they want to bring into this space. And so home might be where you rest your head at night. It might be one of the places where you feel most safe, feel most whole. And an ancestor is someone past or present, blood related or chosen family that you want to honor in the work. And so last thing I'll say there is that by calling it an ancestor, we set this intention to continuously reflect on our past, whether that means understanding power and privilege or finding the through lines of resilience and intergenerational strength. So I see folks are sharing in the chat, and I mean, it's just such a powerful way to really get to know one another just a little bit more. We know it's an imperfect practice, but so grateful for you all. So my Prevention Institute colleagues and I are going to model this, and then without further ado, we will pass it over to our presenters for the day. And so my name is Will Crary, he, him, his pronouns on Ohlone territory in Berkeley, California. Home for me is Berkeley, where it can feel often unstable at times because of the exorbitant cost of living, but I feel deeply comforted by the fruit trees that are all around me, the parks that are all around me, and just the abundance that's here. And an ancestor I want to bring into the space is my grandmother, Anne Handel. She is tough as nails. She was my mom's single mom who raised 3 children in Washington, D.C., where she was a trailblazer in the Office of Economic Opportunity during the War on Poverty. And she helps ground me in my values and the tradition and the Jewish community of Tikkun Olam, which is repairing the world and with the intention of social justice as an end goal. So that's my introduction. I will pass it over to my colleague, Zach.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. I'm Zach. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm also in Ohlone territory in Hayward, California. Home for me, I'd say broadly is California. I've lived all over the state, and I think this will always feel like home to me. And the ancestor I want to call into this space is all the women in my family who've helped raise me and taught me the importance of and strength in caring for others and being in touch with my emotions. I'll pass it to Lisa.
I'm Lisa Lucia Parks, she, her, here in City of Oakland. Oakland, I've lived here for 25 years now. I definitely know that I'm a guest, and it is where I feel most at home, and it just has everything that I need to thrive. So, and in terms of ancestors, there's so many that I want to call in, but my aunt, Pamela Parks, my dad's sister who was killed by her husband.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Yeah, I think this is just such a powerful practice. We invite everyone to continue introducing yourself in this way in the chat. And of course, this is a heavy topic that we're talking about. And so to have the support of our community here, of our lineage here, is just a really wonderful thing. And so now I actually want to invite our presenters today to introduce themselves with this same practice, sharing their name, pronouns, their home, and ancestor, and then briefly just how you got connected to the work that you do. And so first I'm going to invite Strong Oak. If you want to turn your video on and unmute yourself, we would love to hear from you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Strong Oak, Melkiganot Mimkwahanimusi. I'm Maliseet and Mi'kmaq is my ancestry. And I live in Worthington, which is land of the Mohicans. And the ancestors I'd like to call up are from the 7 generations of ancestors who live in my DNA, all of their historical pain and resilience. I want to lift that up. Right now, I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Visioning Bear Circle Intertribal Coalition. Our offices are in South Deerfield, but we really work nationally and regionally. So and we work with tribal, intertribal, and multicultural communities. We provide prevention education, and our calling card really is the Walking in Balance 39-hour transformative justice circle practice training that we do. And so it's aimed at addressing all forms of violence because we see them all connected. And I started out as a journalist, but I'm a survivor, and I guess the source of all being decided that I should be working, especially to work on having children be safe in their communities. So I began working as an advocate for children, first in a state agency, and then now, I've done a lot of work through the Visioning Bear Circle and the Tribal Coalition to keep children safe in community. So it's been since 1970 that I did that. So I graduated from college in '69, so you could see I didn't do the journalist thing too long. So I kind of really look at intergenerational conversations is really important. And I actually, when I think about it, the original people here, we were constantly, almost all the time, in intergenerational community, and we were all learning from each other. And I find that in the work that we do at Visioning Bear, that this is critically important. So I see myself as a intergenerational kind of visionary woman, because I've stayed really vibrant and alive in my thinking all these years, and I can attribute that to having many conversations with really young people. So I worked in a mainstream agency for a long time, and we found that we really couldn't do our work in the same vibrant way that was culturally appropriate, using our circle practices and our restorative approach there. So we had to take that plunge, and we did it. And we formed our own 501c3, a group of people in the community. We did this, and I'm immensely gratified to see that survivors, took it upon themselves to create our own thing. So I think I can pass to the next person.
Yes, thank you for that, Strong Oak. We're excited to absorb more of that vibrancy and energy that you're describing, so apparent in everything that you do. So grateful that you're here. So our next speaker, Aristea Salisbury, is actually not able to join us today. Sadly, she is experiencing a family emergency and could not have put on today's web conference without the preparation of Aristea. And so we're just holding Aristea and Aristea's family in our hearts, and grateful for all the contributions she has made and continues to make to this field. And so she is definitely here with us in spirit. And I'm gonna pass it over to Aristea's beloved colleague, Hillary, to share a little bit about yourself and your work, Hillary, maybe following the model of name, home, ancestor, and how you got connected to this work.
Hi, my name's Hillary Beyer. I live in McKinleyville, California on Wheat land. The ancestor I'd like to call in is my grandpa Bud. When I was a kid and a young adult, when our family experienced challenges, my grandpa Bud provided a lot of buffering that kept me safe from things that could have happened to me. And also, I'd like to acknowledge again Aristea. she's a really great speaker and a really cool lady, and you'd love to have seen her. She's just in my heart and on my mind. I'm the executive director of the McKinleyville Family Resource Center, and I'm also the lead for a project called the Center at McKinleyville. It's an integrated services project. It's got partners from child welfare, mental health, social services, child support, tribal government, medical, nonprofit, and university partners. The reason I've been working on it a long time, since like 2013, the reason I got involved is because I wanted to change service delivery for the place where I live, to make it better, to make it work better for the people who live there. And as we've been working on this, cross-sector interagency collaboration over time, racial equity work came up as important, both among the practitioners and also among community members. And I'm driven in my work by listening and doing what people need, and also doing whatever I can, even when I'm afraid.
Hillary and Strong Oak. Can you hear me okay, Will?
It's a little bit crunchy, but I think I can still hear the words and hear the speaker.
Okay, so community, full disclosure, I'm having repetitive stress syndrome pain. And so Will and I talked yesterday, and I said, accountability buddy, I'm going to rearrange my desk to kind of work with my body a little bit differently. And apparently that has made my sound connection a little bit more challenged. So should I call in, Will?
It sounds clear right now, Lisa, so you can proceed, and we will let you know otherwise. And feel free in the chat, everyone, if you're having challenges, we want to make sure that you're able to experience what we have to share.
Okay, all right, I'll try to speak up and okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your grace. So we're going to kind of build on everything that we've done so far and go deeper into conversation with Strong Oak. So Strong Oak, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. And I would like to ask you to just, well, first of all, community, please feel free to continue. Oh, actually, got a little discombobulated. I think I was supposed to ask Ashley just to report back on a little bit of what's going on in the chat. I know we have a really beautiful community assembled here online, and we were doing introductions. We haven't just with all 172 introductions, but Ashley, would you mind just sharing a couple of impressions of what you're seeing on the chat and where people are calling home and who are some of their ancestors?
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. I'd be happy to. I think that the beautiful thing about asking everyone to respond to those prompts was that people think of home in so many different ways. So I saw a lot of people, referencing like locations, geographic areas, but I also saw people referencing that home is where their family is. And I thought that was really beautiful. And then, my participant list says there's 172 people, but I think that this space that we're sharing together is so much more full than that, based on all of the ancestors that people have been calling in, grandparents, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles. I've been reading some stories that folks are sharing, and it just feels like we are not alone here today. So thank you all so much for participating in that. Lisa, I'll pass it back to you.
Ashley, yay for the big community you've come in. All right, community, and thank you, Strong. We're gonna go into a bit more to learn about your values and practices and work, Strong Oak. So would you mind starting by just telling us a little bit more about the Vision and Care Circle Intertribal Coalition, communities that you work in, and your organization's values and practices of walking in balance with all our relations and protecting Mother Earth?
I'd be honored to do that. I just wanted to put a shout out that the birth of the Visioning Bear Circle Intertribal Coalition owes a big debt of gratitude actually to having been, my participation as in the first cohort for the LEAP program, where I learned a lot of the skills that were necessary for us to give birth to Visioning Bear. So even though on here it says that the mission is to prevent domestic and sexual violence and other interpersonal violence in the tribal, intertribal, and multicultural communities in the Northeast and nationally. Actually, when I think about it, it's about transforming the culture of power in this country from one that promotes violence to one that promotes harmony. And to draw from that, we look at what was the first iteration. I used to always hear, or we used to always hear, about how the root causes were based in racism and sexism. And so, well, what does that really mean? And for Visioning Bear, when we looked at what was really going on, we saw that taking the land, the ownership of the land and the assigning of a cash value to every single thing in the universe, the trees, the plants, the animals, and even different values, valuing pine less than valuing oak and different things like this, were part of an objectification process that came from colonization and a justification for it, the doctrine of discovery, which I find that not a lot of people know about, because this is when Columbus came and he went back after seeing a very gentle and welcoming group of people that he met in the Caribbean. Then he goes back and talks about how it would be easy to take what we have, and because there were no weapons to keep that from happening. And so he got the approval from the esoteric bull from the Pope. It said that if people were not, if they were not Christian, you could take their lands and put people into slavery in perpetuity. And that was a justification. And then the governmental justification was the doctrine of discovery, that anything that was not, owned by Christians or occupied by Christians could be taken. So these two things were used to justify the whole thing. And when you take the land, you took it so that only one group of people could own it. So ironically, we began to see that money and capitalism itself was the first violence. We kind of grew into this because when you think about objectifying it, even us on this call, all our land is paid for and we're not all paid the same. And some of us don't have homes and some of us don't have access to resources in any kind of equitable way. So this became like a real big part of our mission, is to transform the culture of power. I think I probably said it about as good as I can, that the same justifications are here. Like when you see what happened in the January 6th insurrection, you see people longing to go back to the day when the system got put in place where only white male Christians could own land and only they could vote, only they could be educated. You see them, taking away the power of choice from women, and you see that we still don't have parity. So all these things are still in place, and we're in danger, of rolling back. But it's so I think maybe I've said enough. If anyone, has some questions to ask, or that would be good.
Thank you so much.
And I just a slide there. Just want to talk about it to get ready. The eagle and the condor feather that you see in the forefront, this represents when the cultures come together, because we really believe that all cultures need to be in equitable relation with each other to mend the sacred hoop, that we all come from a common ancestor. So this would represent the prophecy that says that this will definitely happen at some point. So to me, it's a real hopeful thing, and we use it for our talking piece, and we set a sacred space whenever we hold circle, and people are invited to bring things to it that they find really makes them feel safe or is special to them. And as we go along, like you see, there's a blue rose there that came to me from work that I did in Wyoming, from the tribal communities there. They gifted that, and then as we travel, we just keep adding things to our center. But that center is really important because before you even meet with people, just like we did here, there was a lot of work that went to get ready for this event we're having. So we get ready for our groups by setting our intentions way before we actually have our circles. And it's a spiritual thing. It's a way to bring in your culture into wherever you are. So I'll leave some room, there, for people to ask questions. And there's another slide that comes up. I think it might be the next one. I'm not sure. Yes, this slide was came when I was at a Just Beginnings Collaborative gathering in California, and Claudia Lopez did it. She's a graphic person, so while I was talking and explaining what the whole Walking in Balance program is, she was capturing it in a photo, and I said, really, it speaks 1,000 words, because it right on it, there's a lot of the things that are in our program. And when the group of people from Visioning Bear, and these are survivors in the community, we created a curriculum, and we created through our circle practice. And what we did is look at all the values from all the different tribes, including in South Africa, Central and South America. We included every value that we could think of, and we boiled it down to really 12 big values. And then we looked at, well, and what were the original instructions, meaning the first thing that when the first people came here, what the source really, which I call, creator, or whatever you want to say, the name of that creative source is, what they really wanted us to do to take care of the place that we're living on. And really, all the plants and animals were here long before we got here. And our first thing was to really have respect for them, because they were going to be teaching us how to live here. And the first thing we needed to do is to look at, having respect for that, and having humility that we're not there was plants and animals here long before we got here. And that equity and respect, including reciprocity with all the plants and animals. And we talk about peace and justice, because the original peace was about addressing harm, like the Great Law of Peace that the Onondaga created, that the colonists knew very much about. Really, it was about going to the biggest harm doer in each of the 5 nations, and for that person to be healed before they moved on to the next. And they went through this until the 5th and final nation, where the greatest harm doer happened to reside, needed to, be healed for any successful peace to take place. And only then did they do their Great Law of Peace, which is a really intensely complicated, comprehensive document, where both all the sexes and all the gender, everybody is equitable in that model. So, Benjamin Franklin had access to that model. He spent a lot of time, with the community, and yet when they developed the Constitution, they left, it was seriously lacking all these values. So the empathy, like, if you don't approach things from love, and you don't approach from the heart, then no change can take place of any significance. It won't move until people are moved in their heart. And that takes a lot of work. And to have compassion is to build it, like respect for all of our relations, including the plants and the animals. And then having the courage to speak up when you see harm in front of you, and having the skills to do that. And there's a lot in the way to keep us from doing that. I mean, you could see that modeled in the government that we work on now, because the higher up that you are in the system, the more they talk about leaks, and the more secrets are kept, and the more information is withheld from the community that it needs to really live well and to prevent violence. So talking about, those things you build up, like compassion is to be able to acknowledge other people's way of walking and to hear it without judgment. And then to beyond that, to have empathy, to recognize that our needs are pretty much the same. And like, how is it that some of us aren't getting them met? And then to have the empathy about how it would feel if we didn't have that. And then wisdom is about sharing everything you know, not hoarding that information, sharing it and having a responsibility to share it. It's beyond just sharing it. It's like an accountability that you have, that all of these gifts came from the Creator. It came from spiritual world. And so you have an obligation to share your gifts, and then to look at your life with gratitude and to have generosity. Generosity would overturn the system we now have, because generosity would be predicated on giving everything that extra that you have, that you would give that to someone. And it's, the circle itself, I'm looking at the chat a little bit. The circle itself really teaches this. It's amazing when people get in circle, there's something about the circle itself that brings forward a feeling of safety that allows people to really share how they really feel. So you can bring up uncomfortable feelings. It's important that people bring up what they really feel, even if it wouldn't be like the politically correct thing to do, because you don't move and change till you hear in a storytelling way how other people see things. And so we do not only circle process, but dialogues across differences for those hard conversations that some of us may have had, even around with our families. I'm just thinking of the last 4 years that we had with Trump, and like how people's families, there were a lot of hard conversations people had to have with their families. And they could only do that through a prism of love and compassion, and like with a lot of pain too. There's been a lot of pain in these last years looking at everything. And this circle practice, it's the circle itself that's a big deal. So when we teach it, we don't teach it with just one person or one or even two. We have people stationed in the 4 directions to make the democracy there. And each person has a point of contact or content that they need to do. And when they do that content, it blends so much into the circle itself that, people forget that they're really, they know who there are teachers, but it becomes a conversation where everyone's wisdom is coming out. And we were able to monitor great change that comes from this. People actually changed how they spent their time, how they were with their families, and what they considered to be important. A lot of self-care began to happen. And I don't know if this is the place where I can just share that we took us 6 years to develop. Yeah, maybe I should stop here so, and allow people to ask me some questions. And it just when I think about how much we all grow, I mean, I've grown so much just from being, teaching this curriculum actually has changed me. And like my ideas about money being the first violence didn't come to quite late in the game, when I realized, oh my God, everything's owned. Like our time, everything is owned. And like, how do we get out of that? And when I first started talking about this, people didn't really get the connection between the land. That's because ownership was the big deal. And with the land didn't consent to be owned. Women didn't consent to not being able to vote at one time. Women didn't consent to get paid less. Where is the consent for a tree that's being chopped down? Where is the consent for the food that you eat? Where is that consent? And Native peoples, we did do that kind of consent. we actually ask the plants, and before we take them, we have reciprocal relations with them. And actually, the biggest loss is at one time, and I know people today now, so I can say at one time, and still today, there are people who can actually see beyond the obvious when we look at each other. They can actually know who you are, see you fully, see more of you than is ordinary. And they had those kind of relations with the plants and animals, so people could do that. And I just really wanted to share, too, that a lot of our ceremonies that were kept and seen as illegal, and we couldn't practice them until Jimmy Carter, legalized it in the mid 1970s. There are some things that don't heal from 7 generations back without a big ceremony. It takes a long time to get ready for them, but the one I want to just hold up right now is the wiping of the tears ceremony that I went through recently in Wisconsin at the Women and Water Coming Together symposium hosted by Mary Ellen Baker. I participated in the wiping of the tears ceremony, which was about looking at the pain from 7 generations. And before I participated in the ceremony, all this pain came up inside me. I didn't know it wasn't just my pain. And like the pain all came. Okay, am I talking too long here?
Can you hear me stronger?
Uh-oh, yeah, Strong Oak. No, all of that was just so powerful. We're really grateful that you were able to string together so many generations of wisdom and experiences that not only go back through tribal sovereignty, but up through the context of how the government has transformed practices that are really important to the work that you do. And I'm seeing some questions come up in the chat around how we bring these practices, how do we introduce these practices into our organizations and communities? And I think that's something we'll actually get an opportunity to discuss a little bit further as we move into our open discussion. But just as we close out this short portion, Strong Oak, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what we see on the slide here, specifically about this evaluation framework that you all have, which puts these values, as I understand it, into practice and helps you all kind of interpret the impact in a tangible way, which maybe isn't always the most thoughtful way of doing something, but for better or for worse, that is the universe we currently live in.
Let's see, I'll try to be really brief about it. We developed this, it took us 6 years with Morgan J. Curtis and with Patrick Lemon working with us as evaluation consultants the whole time. Like we were like ecstatic that in our evaluation, because we actually record our sessions and we record the changes. So we were trying to figure out how to make that into data that could be usable to really demonstrate. So this is based on Michael Quinn Patton's principles of, I don't know, God, I'm just like blitzing out on the name, principle-based evaluation, which really allows for you to look at process and it looks at behavior, like what you do is reflected on what you believe inside. So it took us a while to wrap our minds around it. So we reduced it to 4 principles, and then we can look at the transcripts of the sessions and we can see where they go. And then so then they can be demonstrated, based on like the uphold the perspective that harm can be healed and support others to identify their truth. So to get people to be able to speak honestly about their truth and have more of a voice, and to facilitate connection and cultivate, those values that I was talking about. So we basically, I'm telling you, this took 6 years. When I'm looking at it, I'm like, whoa. And we're willing to share this with anyone. It's like, because we think that for a lot of BIPOC communities, this kind of a model of doing evaluation would really probably work with a more storytelling oral kind of format. So I think that's the brief of it. And I'm really happy to talk to anyone and share with anyone later on. If you contact Visioning Bear, we'd be happy to talk to you about this more.
Definitely. Well, thank you for that, Strong Oak. And of course, 6 years and multiple generations of work will never fit onto a slide or into a web conference, but we're grateful that you were able to package it for us. And of course, we want to keep having these conversations. I just want to lift up too how important it is that you are putting into practice the values of showing the impact of your work in a way that doesn't just fit the squares and circles of typical traditional evaluation practices, which are not reflective of how we can actually describe the progress of our work, the importance of our work. So really grateful that you brought that into this space. And so continuing the gratitude for Strong Oak, we're going to come back to Strong Oak in a little bit here, but I want to move over to our friends over in McKinleyville. And so again, welcoming Hillary back to the stage and just honoring Aristea, who we see here in the photo. Hillary is going to speak on behalf of Aristea and probably be very humble about not being able to bring the same heat as Aristea, but we know that Hillary is just such an important leader in this work. We're really grateful that you can join us, Hillary. And so the first question I wanted to ask you, Hillary, is just to hear a little bit about the context of your work in Humboldt County and the McKinleyville community, and then more broadly, the work of the McKinleyville Family Resource Center.
Yeah, sure. So I'm in Humboldt County, California, which is in the Redwoods. We're on the North Coast. So if you know California, you know where San Francisco is. We're about 6 hours north of there. It's a long state. And I live in McKinleyville, which is in northern Humboldt. There's a bay in the middle of our county, and we're just north of the bay. McKinleyville's on Wheat land. McKinleyville is an unincorporated community of about 17,000 people. There's 134,000 people in Humboldt County, 17,000 in McKinleyville. And the center at McKinleyville, which is our integrated services site, is intended to serve the northern region of Humboldt County, so a population of about 45,000 people. And a little bit of demographics about the county. 6% of the people who live in Humboldt County are Indigenous. That's compared to a little less than 1% in the state of California. And since the settler invasion in the 1850s, the economy here has been based on a series of extractive industries. So the biggest ones, logging, then fishing, and then pot, marijuana. And on the north coast of California, there is the largest tribe, federally recognized tribe by population in California. That's the Yurok tribe. Also the largest reservation by landmass, that's the Hoopa Reservation. So the organization that I run is called the McKinleyville Family Resource Center. We're like a small or medium-sized, we've got about $1 million budget, and about 60% of that is county government funding and about 40% is foundation funding. We do direct service. We also do some prevention programming, looking at child abuse prevention, intimate partner violence prevention, asthma prevention, mitigation. We also do training and consulting, so mental health first aid trainings, yoga. We also do racial equity trainings and consulting. And then a really big project that we're working on is this integrated services project with all of the partners, looking at redesigning how services are delivered in our region of the county.
Thank you. I mean, it's so important to hear about kind of the geographic and demographic details that situate your work. And of course, they pose so many challenges and opportunities. And so maybe it might be helpful for our audience, our community here, to hear a little bit about how the work of preventing intimate partner violence is connected to partnerships and alliances that you all are working on. And I hear you talk about the integration of services within the center. And I think our audience might want to hear a little bit more too about how working with other partners is an important piece of this work. And of course, I'll stop here and just say full disclosure that Prevention Institute organizes a project that the McKinleyville Family Resource Center is a member of, called Safety Through Connection. And we would love to share more about that too. So we'll start with Hillary then.
Yeah, the first thing that I want to say about that is that my perspective over the 8 years of working on this project has changed. And I want to kind of take you through that. Like at first, I was like, this system is not working for the people that it's intended for, and it's hurting people, and it treats people like not human. And I thought, let's change the system so that we can have a system that treats people with respect in a way that preserves their dignity. And I was really thinking at that time about the ideas of connection and agency. So like people being connected to each other is essential for humans, and also feeling like we have some control over what happens to us. And then as I started doing the service integration work and working with people in all of the different systems, I realized that people who are working in the helping professions are dehumanized by the systems that they're working in. And I thought, how are people going to treat others as humans when they're not treated as humans themselves? And so I've been doing a lot of relationship-based leadership development and having people like see themselves as whole people, and understanding that that is what we need to do in order to do the type of high quality work that we want to do. And then I came to understand the impact of racist systems on the people who, on all of us. And, you know, it's like the disproportionality of impact, like kids in foster care, or like who's getting kicked out of school, but also the explicit exclusion of tribal governments and tribal organizations from rooms where decisions were being made and processes. So one of the things that came out of that was we've decided we're going to have anti-racism training for all. So like basic training, like what is racism and how does it work? Whose land are we on? How did that happen? And what is settler colonialism, and how are we participating in that? And then the system change consulting. So that's working directly with people who have power, who want to make change. And that's the place where our staff who's doing the racial equity work is most interested in working, because that's the button they think that they can push that's going to change stuff. And then we also, the Family Resource Center, as lead for the integration project, we're working on organizations being able to work together, but also we're contracted to do the community engagement. And so we put together processes for partners to receive community feedback, and accountability for people to hear how partners respond to that feedback. Like, what are they going to do once they heard what people say? And then also we're using this community engagement role to amplify community-driven projects. So like the Black student unions for several local high schools hosted listening sessions for their administrators. And then we brought our evaluation resources to write a report for them, so that in the future administrators could just read the report and not have to listen to the kids, or the kids not having to say it again. Or being home for community-driven projects like a bias reporting app where people can map their experiences to share with other people for safety. And then back office support for community-driven projects like the Native Women's Collectives, their programming that they're doing for girls and femmes. So the community engagement work, it builds trust among community members and center partners. And it helps us like work on the system change from multiple directions. So, and then we see racialized violence is related to intimate partner violence and child abuse and bullying and all kinds of violence because of its intention to dominate this idea that you'd like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and asserting power over others. And so, and we don't think that this curtain way is working well for anyone. So we're involved in some racial justice work that is like separate technically from the center. And we work with existing alliances. So like the McKinleyville Alliance for Racial Equity. And there's a report that's going to go in the chat later that talks about community conditions currently in McKinleyville. And then the Equity Alliance of the North Coast, which is a group of people who are working together in lots of different ways on racial justice work. And we're also doing some work to help build cross-racial solidarity. So projects with AAPI groups, Native Women's Collective, Black-led groups, and doing projects based on common experiences to build more relationships.
Thank you so much for that, Hillary. I'm wanting to lift up just how important the community engagement and the meaningful community involvement that you all are putting forth is, and just how you're actively disrupting power imbalances, especially rooted in this cultural humility and the respect that you all bring to the work. And I guess I'm curious, because we know similar projects, if they're not done with this intersectional justice lens, can perpetuate harm. I want to hear about how the McKinleyville Family Resource Center has built these partnerships, specifically with tribal organizations and Indigenous communities in the McKinleyville area.
Yeah, so our one really successful strategy for us is to support existing work and recognize that there's already people who've been doing work all along, and to see what we can do to support that work, and intentionally centering Indigenous voices in the center's work. We also make sure to be clearly treating tribal governments as federal governments and modeling that practice for partners, because it's not a consistent practice. And this semester, we've got the whole staff taking the Intro to Native American Studies class together at Humboldt State. And we're working with the Native American Studies Department to pilot a certificate program for people who are working in social services or other related professions in our community, to just have this basic level of understanding. And then I think for me personally, the biggest thing that I am doing is pushing to center Indigenous voices in spaces that are not inclusive. So if I get let into rooms, and if I'm let into the room, then I'm going to fight like hell once I'm in there.
Yeah, and I think I remember you saying, Hillary, when we connected before this web conference, that being invited into a space to support a collaborative effort for justice-oriented work led by or with BIPOC community, and not showing up after that invitation has been received, is just as damaging as so much of the harm that is already perpetuated. And so I know that's something that you and your organization really take to heart, and is visible in the internal organizational change that you all are focused on with building staff capacity, whether that's by training yourselves and then bringing that training to others in the community, others in government agency partners. And so really grateful for that. We're gonna Well, actually, I know on our next slide, we just want to invite some reflections from our participants as well. And so the question says, does your organization partner with Indigenous leaders or organizations or engage in other activities to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities? And so we just want to hear a little bit from those of you on the call with us. And maybe while you're answering that, we can go back to that last slide. And Hillary, if you could just take another couple minutes here to tell us, give us some more examples maybe of what these different efforts look like to be in solidarity with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, sure. So there's our building. It's so pretty. It's actually surrounded by a fence right now. It's almost done. I'm so looking forward to being able to be inside. But inside the space, we've got the design and plan for featuring the Wiyot language, because the Center at McKinleyville is on Wiyot land, and then also other local languages inside of the physical space where you can see as soon as you come in. The Wiyot tribe gave the center a name. It's Dane Nutwadak. What it means is we help each other. And that's on the sign out front, and will be on the on display inside. And then we're not in there yet, but we're doing some projects that center Indigenous leadership. And one of them is this project with the Native Women's Collective. And so the Native Women's Collective has been working with Girls and Femmes to do youth-led work. And what the youth had said was interesting to them was volleyball. And so they've been doing a volleyball camp over the last couple of summers. And this summer where we worked with them, and then we wrote a grant to support to build the work out. So now this camp is going to be a sleepover camp, and now there's going to be some activities with the Girls and Femmes in the lead up to it around menstruation and self-care and yoga and conditioning. So topics that the youth have identified as something that they'd like to learn more about. And then what I do personally in my role is I've been in my position for 12 years. I've built a lot of relationships, and I've become radicalized over the last 2 years. And I'm using the relationships that I've built to move money to community groups as fast as I can. And then also using the organization and relationships as much as we can to buffer community from the damaging impact of systems. So trying to take as much of the heat as we can.
Thank you for that, Hillary. And Ashley, I'm wondering if you can unmute and share a little bit about what we're seeing in the chat here in response to what Hillary was sharing, as well as our chat question.
Yeah, absolutely will. So, there are quite a few people that said no, or not right now, maybe not even sure. But then there are folks that are engaged in relationships, who are maybe, I'm trying to find it. Oh, it was Doug that said, constantly rooting out colonized ways of thinking and working, which I think, is such, maybe speaks to some of the other questions that are coming up in the chat of like, what's the first step that we take? How do we do this? And so maybe it's an internal process like that. But there are some examples of contracting with Indigenous-led evaluation firms, partnering closely with local bands and tribes. So yeah, there are some examples coming up. And then of course, those questions of like, we want to do this and we're not sure how.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Ashley. And that's what this conversation is about, right? We don't have all of the answers, and part of this is modeling that. We're acknowledging that doing this work with deep intention takes time and is imperfect because of the violence and structural inequities that Strong Oak was mentioning earlier on. And Doug, I'm just so appreciative. I didn't get a chance to read what you wrote, but just hearing the words of our colonized ways of doing and working, naming that someone else, I think, named that resources aren't geared towards this type of work, where we're setting deep intention of acknowledging one another's presence, honoring the land, honoring the original stewards, and connecting with one another. So doing this work often isn't built with those goals in mind. And so I'm appreciating that we were able to do that here, and also acknowledging that we're running out of time because of those intentions and because of the limitations of how we do this work. And so I'm gonna keep us moving forward here. I wanna invite my colleague, Zach, on for just a couple minutes here to help us make a connection between Indigenous-led transformative movements and specifically the public health field and public health strategies for safety and well-being. So Zach, if you want to join us for a moment here.
Sure, thanks, Will. So for my capstone project, I recently completed a Master's of Public Health degree based out of San Francisco. And the topic of this web conference kind of really spoke to what I had done during that research project, and looking at the connection between violence against the land and gender-based violence, and where public health has an opportunity to uplift Indigenous knowledge and kind of move forward. So for my project, I took a political economy approach to kind of look at the history of land use, particularly in the state of California, and the connections between violence against the land in the form of displacement of Indigenous communities, and then forcibly acquiring mostly forestry land and lands that Indigenous groups had for centuries been stewards of and had successfully maintained in ways that preserved both environmental health and community health. And the context that I was really interested in looking at this was how public health can return to Indigenous knowledge and lifeways in order to reduce the impacts of the climate fires and wildfires that that California and the Western United States continue to face every year. So I found a lot of work that folks across the state are doing, some up near where Hillary's based, the Karuk tribe and the Yurok tribe, as well as the Mono tribe in the Central Valley, are all doing a lot of work around bringing back Indigenous land management practices and controlled burn practices that had previously been criminalized by the government, to bring environment back into balance and kind of restore that environmental health. So I think the argument that I tried to make was that public health's in a unique position to, as policymakers or community or on the ground working in community engagement, to reach out to these tribal groups that have historically been stewards of the land for centuries, and find ways to partner that really uplift that land use knowledge and controlled burn knowledge in order to preserve environmental health and reduce the impact of wildfires on communities across the state.
It's such important work. It's not something that I get to interact with very closely, and so to hear you talk about it, Zach, as being an expert in that field, is really important for me to kind of understand this analogy of what it might mean for our field in violence prevention, specifically gender-based violence prevention, how to embed practices that have been stewarded by Indigenous communities in a way that honors those practices and honors that leadership. And so really grateful that you could share that with us. And so we have about 15 minutes left here. We want to share some resources with you all as well. And so we're going to put those slides up as our speakers share some final thoughts with us in response to these two questions, but also know that we're going to share this slide deck and share these resources and tools afterwards. So for the rest of our time, I really do want to hear both of our speakers here responding to both these questions or whatever you feel called to. And so the questions that we have here on the slide can be answered in either order. And we just want to know a little bit about how your work connects to the public health field. and how it is supporting the public health field evolve the values of public health, and also pivot towards some of these ideas that you were describing around power imbalances, acknowledging colonization and how that shows up in our work and in the conditions we're trying to transform. And then specifically, what do you want non-Indigenous people and organizations working on sexual and domestic violence prevention to know or do to honor Indigenous leadership, especially bringing back this idea of cautiousness around co-optation and appropriation? So we can start, Strong Oak, if you want to share a bit on either of these questions, however you'd like.
What I wanted to do, this came to mind for me is, what did I really want to say? I think that Indigenous voices are largely not really integrated that well into all the different practices. That's my experience. But I have like two really good ways I can give concrete examples of that. But I'm on the first ever Governor's Statutory Commission on Restorative Justice as part of criminal reform in Massachusetts. And on that committee, even though they were using restorative practices, which all of them got from the community from Canada that came, the Indigenous community, and our voices, are largely like not only completely marginalized in that process now. So what we did is we hosted a transforming the culture of power, where we actually put front and center Native peoples and BIPOC communities, where we centered the voices of Indigenous people, and it was extremely well received, and actually was like people were hungry for that. The other part in terms of public health and funding, I wanted to say that we had a very bad experience in Massachusetts where, Visioning Bear, we didn't want any state and federal money because we felt we would lose the liberation of our voices. And we find that's really true. At one point, we found out, we were actually marginalized, and all people of color were marginalized, and people living in rural communities were marginalized because the application process we were forced to deal with in Massachusetts didn't allow a save function for the application process. So everything had to be uploaded all at once. And I watched the dial go around, and I couldn't upload all my stuff, even though I had started very early in the morning. So we couldn't get funding, and we were the only Native application. But in pursuing all of that and actually meeting with all the folks at DPH, we found that there's a lot of secrecy and racism that goes on at the top that never gets transferred back to the communities that don't know that this is going on. So I just say that there's a lot of racism involved in who gets funding, even on the highest of levels. And we need to deal with that. And then, the control of the conversation once you do get those big monies. These are a concern. And I can say it because I don't get state and federal money, so I'm not worried. So I'll just leave it at that.
Right. And I think, it's so important to hear you say that too, Strong Oak, because I think those of us who do receive funds from the federal government, state government, local agencies, we can hear what you're sharing and acknowledge that and take action based on those disparities and inequities and how resources are shared, how decisions are made. And so to actually operationalize what is it that we do with that information is so important. And I think that's why it was really powerful to have you here, as well as Hillary, with different experiences in this work. And so I want to hear, Strong Oak, your response to the last question too, but maybe I'll pivot to Hillary really quickly because I think it feels like a natural transition. So Hillary, do you want to share a little bit about how your work is helping evolve public health values in practice?
Yeah, so my education is in social work, but because of the Integrated Services Project, I've got to do a lot of work with public health people, and I feel like maybe I did the wrong program. The public health people are really the people who best understand the work that we're doing, and it's this idea that building how the community is primary prevention, and that there's connections between a lot of the things that are making us sick, like asthma and diabetes and violence. And so, I mean, we partner with public health, but also we feel very connected to the public health and the approach. And then, is this the time where I get to talk about what I want non-Indigenous people and organizations to know, or is that later?
No, go for it. Let's hear.
Okay. All right. So I would say no history, no local history and national history, because context matters. And know how issues that are local to you, like water rights and climate change, which is local to everyone, relate to that history. And think about ways that you can stand in solidarity with local tribes, like giving the land back. Know that you'll mess up if you're working with a community that you're not part of. That is going to happen, and be dedicated to try and grow and be humbled. And then again, respect sovereignty. Tribes are federal governments, and not everybody knows that or recognizes that. And then I was led into a room one time where there was decisions being made, and I was talking to a friend about how I felt like I was the wrong person to be in the room, and she very kindly educated me, and she said, if they let you in, then you need to get in there and you need to fight like hell. And so if they let you in a room, make a scene. And then also expanding your window of tolerance. So be brave. If you're not afraid, like you're not trying hard enough, be uncomfortable. As a person who runs a majority government funded organization, and we're contracted to change government systems, I also look at expanding the government systems window of tolerance. In the relationship that I'm in, how far can I push? And then how can we get used to that? And then when do we up it and push some more? And what I use as like an indicator is if I feel like I'm about to throw up, then I'm in the right space. So, and make friends.
When you say that, Hillary, I'm thinking about, I've been on that committee, the RJAC, it's called the Restorative Justice Advisory Committee. And I went there, and it was right after George Floyd, and we really wanted them to change the language to look at how they looked at restorative justice in the aftermath of what happened to George Floyd and its impact on this country. And they didn't want to use the language, that they didn't want to use language that dealt directly with racism and stuff. And so what I did was I was doing a circle that day, like they were not working in circle at all. And like, so I just said that I didn't want to be a part of something that did harm. And I talked about, how I felt marginalized. I really just spoke of it. And I said, I really feel marginalized here when these practices really come, from Indigenous people. And then other survivors in the committee and Black people began to speak up and say, I've got 3 degrees and I don't feel like I have a voice at this table. Most of the people on the committee had no knowledge of restorative justice. Out of the 17 people, only 6 did. And so then immediately we had this horrible Robert's Rules kind of conversation going on. And then we pivoted to the circle, and then we went around the circle and people were able to share from their hearts. So after that, everybody started wanting to do the work in circles and began to think about in more inclusive folks. And I was stunned that it could be that impactful. To speak your truth from your heart could have that kind of impact. And, and to hear other people talk from their heart and how that moved the whole big system. And like it's continuing, like trying to figure out how to work with open meeting laws that are designed to kind of try to be inclusive, but in many ways it does not afford or allow for inclusion, actually. it shuts people out in these incredible ways. So at least we're struggling with all of that. You know what I mean? I appreciate the struggle. After a year and a half of boring, horrible meetings, it's become
Yeah.
fun. It's like, and all of a sudden they were listening to the voices of people in reentry and people who were in the prison system, and listening and hearing directly from them about their work on restorative justice. So yeah, it's like, and you got to be brave though.
Yeah.
Actually, you gotta be
And
so
I think,
fearless. You don't care if they're gonna throw you out. That's how I am. Throw me out because I don't have time to waste my time.
well, there's a lot of imagery here between Strong Oak. I hope you're not getting thrown out of anywhere, but maybe if you are, that means you're doing the right thing. And Hillary, with your queasiness as a indicator of you're doing the right thing. I'm appreciating both of those. So as we wrap up here, Tori dropped a question in the chat about, well, I'll just read it. It says, what are you compelled to do as a result of what you have learned today? And so we'd love just to hear your thoughts on what action might look like in response to what our two impassioned presenters have shared with us. And maybe, just because I don't know if we fully got a response to this, while those responses are coming in from our participants, Strong Oak, if we can revisit that last question, we just have about another minute left here. If you want to share a little bit about what does it look like for non-Indigenous organizations and people to show up in right relationship to honor Indigenous leadership as we all move forward in this gender-based violence work and sexual and domestic violence prevention work?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is to not worry about appropriation, ask and respectfully honor where you get information. And to me, that is a way of keeping the dominant culture in place. If we can't change the structure in which we talk, to me, circle, process is something to be shared among all cultures. The most important thing I want to say is that we really need to be in equity with each other, which means that we need to intend that community where all the cultures come together in equity, whether that means dropping white supremacy or transforming pain, whatever that takes, because I feel like we're all in pain at this point. So to me, it's about holding each other and taking all the gifts that we all bring and equitably holding that, and just acknowledging where we get our information. I don't know if that really answers the question in the way in which people thought, but
no,
I get that asked all the time about the appropriation issue. And I say, well, if everything's appropriative, then we get stuck with the same hierarchical structure. I mean, what's it called? Assimilation, when you have to adopt somebody else's structure, and an appropriation when they want to adopt a different way. I feel like, okay, please appropriate the circle and give every voice an equitable time and space, and ditch the hierarchy, because it really is violence built right in it. And so yeah, appropriate our circle, but just acknowledge, where this came from.
Absolutely. Yeah, we certainly don't want people to not leave with those lessons learned. And so we appreciate you sharing that one action. And there's some really powerful actions being shared in the chat as well. Our time is out here. Zach is scrolling through some of the resources that were mentioned and that supported today's web conference. These were shared by our guest presenters and are helpful tools that we hope you all can make use of and honor. And like Strong Oak was just saying, and we're going to share these out, slide deck, as well as all of these resources. And lastly, here we have the contact information for our guest presenters, as well as the staff at Prevent Connect, Valor US, and Prevention Institute. And we're just so grateful for your participation, your wholeness in this work as you shared about yourself and learned about others. And just so grateful. And I'm going to pass it to Ashley if you want to say some parting words as well.
Thank you, Will. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today and for all of your engagement. Many, many thanks to Strong Oak, Hillary, and of course, we're thinking of Estrella. And Will, Lisa, Zach, thank you as always for your partnership. Thank you to our captioners. And again, thank you to our community. You know, we wouldn't be able to have these web conferences if you weren't continuing to show up and engage in these conversations. And thank you also, Tori, for all of your help with the tech. So with that, we will end this web conference for today. We do have the slides available for you to download. We will be making all of the links that have been shared available. The recording should also be up. What day is it today? Probably early next week, but we'll send an email out when that is ready. So thank you all so much. Take care. This will end our web conference for today. In about a couple of minutes, if you do not leave the Zoom room, we are going to gently push you into a waiting room so we can do a debrief with our presenters. Thank you all so much. Take care.